Throughout our exploration of the Express project and how Express works and all of its components, we have touched on routing on several different occasions in multiple different videos. So hopefully the concept of routing is becoming more and more familiar, and with the repetition, hopefully your innate understanding of routing is really starting to solidify, and it feels more normal and more natural now. So what we're going to do in this video is we are going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into exactly what routes are, exactly what routers are. And to do that, we're going to begin with just the basics of routing. And we're going to cover that without speaking about anything else as it applies to Express. That way, we're addressing specifically the concepts of routing in the context of handling an HTTP request based on the path of that HTTP request. Now, if we remember, we kind of dissected HTTP paths when we talked about how middleware works. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and we are going to dive into, instead of middleware, knowing that routes and routers are a form of middleware, we're now going to talk about how the exact path and routing works within a web application. And then we'll get into the basics of routing based on an HTTP route. And then in a separate video, we will get into what exactly the router middleware is and a little bit deeper into how it works as it applies to Express. So let's start off with just the basics of routing. And this is universal across pretty much every single web application architecture there is, whether it be a monolithic web application, whether it be an MVC application architecture, or just a custom application architecture built on top of a generic HTTP framework like Express, or whether it be in an API, a RESTful API, or any other type of API. We're just going to talk about routing in a generic manner. Now, in previous videos, we've kind of talked about the fact that it all starts with the HTTP request and the URL that makes up that request. So let's focus on that first. Every HTTP request has some base components to it, and one of those components is the actual request origin, where the request is coming from, and then where the request is going to, which is the endpoint that we're looking to hit if we're in an API, or the web page that we're trying to get to if it's a web application. And the request URL usually starts out with, http:// and then www.mycoolapp or something like that .com. And so this makes up the domain part of the URL. And we have our primary domain, secondary domain, and then our subdomains all within this. But we're just going to call this right here the domain, or the location where we're trying to pull a resource. Now, the actual resource that we're trying to get a hold of, that is going to be dealt with in the path, or the information that follows the actual domain. When we talk about the path, it's anything after the .com or the .edu or the .biz. Anything off of that primary domain is going to be the path. And so if it's a simple slash like we have right here, we know we are talking about the root of the web application. But that's usually followed by something like a particular resource. And if we're talking about a regular web or a static website, we're talking about like index.html. That would be a form of path after the domain. So this is a valid path right here, so we'll put it right there. Another valid path, if we're talking about a web application, so something that's dynamically generating the HTML pages, it could just look like this, with no file type specified. And that's because instead of it pulling an actual asset or resource, this being a static resource, an HTML page that is pre-constructed and stored just simply on the website, and it's delivered statically by our HTTP server. Instead, we have what is called a route or a path to a dynamically generated resource, which would be this index. And the reason why it doesn't have a file type after it is because we're not looking for a specific file type. The result of calling this particular resource on this URL, it could be a dynamically generated HTML file. So the results of calling this, let's go ahead and kind of enumerate those so we know what we're talking about, the possibilities could be. So let's do this. Let's label everything so we know what everything is as we're talking about this. So here we've got our domain. We're just gonna, looks like we need to change the color to an actual color. Oh, that didn't work. So let's just add a new one. We'll call it domain. So here's our domain. And then this would be our path in our URL. And the entire thing together would be our URL for our HTTP request, or URI. Sometimes you'll hear it called a URI. So we got our domain. Then we got the path, which is appended to our domain. This path right here would result in a static HTML page. And so we want to go ahead and label that so we know that this is static. It's an actual resource or file that is on the web server. So we'll call it static file. And it is a static file. And so what is returned with this request from a website is going to be a static file that is stored on that web server somewhere. Now, as a result to this one, since it doesn't have a hard-coded file type like CSS or HTML or PNG or any type of asset file, which would be a static file on a web server, this path, because it has no file type, is going to be dynamic. And so with that being dynamic, what we could have being passed back from this particular route or path could be a dynamically generated HTML. So it could be a web page. It also could be JSON data. It could be XML data. It could be binary data. There's a lot of different things that could come as a result of calling this particular route, because it is just a generic route on our web server. So let's go ahead and identify that it could be a dynamically generated HTML, could be JSON, could be XML, and of course could be binary data that's sent back. Or some kind of encoded data, right? It could be encoded data, not necessarily just binary. So this right here could map to any of this, and most of the time, if it's an index or some kind of a generic path like that, you're probably going to get some generated HTML. Now, sometimes you're going to see a route or a path on an HTML request or HTTP request that is going to look something like this. Let's go to our text tool, show our path, and let's get rid of that little arrow that magically popped up in our world. Go back to our text tool. All right. Sometimes you're going to see routes or paths on your domain, on your HTTP request, that look like this. Products, and then slash some kind of a product ID right here. Now, these are going to be a little bit more complex routes. And these kinds of routes, usually what happens is we are implying a resource. So we're specifying that we have a resource that we're after, and that's what this part of the path represents, is a resource. So let's go ahead and identify that as a resource. So that's the resource. And then usually when the route, or inside of that HTTP path, we have something that looks like this, or just a number by itself, what we're looking at usually is going to be the ID of a unique one of these resources. So it's going to be the UID or unique ID of the resource that we're after. So what would be the results of, mycoolapp.com/product/a unique ID? Well, usually what we're going to get back from that is going to be, especially if it's an API, what we're going to be getting back is we're going to be getting back JSON, or if it's an older API, it could be XML, or it could be some binary or encoded data. Let's add encoded to that really quick. Could be encoded data. So we'll just do binary/encoded. All right. So this is a kind of a more complex path or route that is coming in from a client. And if we're following more of a RESTful design of our application, whether it be a monolithic standard web application that is generating dynamic HTML or pages, or it be an API, a RESTful API, this is going to represent the resources that we're after. And then we're going to have a unique ID that represents a specific instance of that. Now, the other part of basic routing in any web application, no matter what framework it is, of course, with the domain and the path, that's all part of HTTP, we're also going to have the method. So let's go ahead and add the method in here so we can see how the method affects this. So let's go ahead and add the method, and I'm going to put the method right over here. So let's create our header right here, and let's talk about HTTP method. And the method is all part of this routing and how routing works inside of web applications. So we have our HTTP method, and in this situation right here where we are getting a static, or where we're trying to pull a static resource, which would be a static file, in this case an HTML file, but it could be a JSON or a PNG, or it could be a JavaScript file or something like that. What we're usually going to have is the HTTP method that is associated with pulling or getting a resource is the get method of HTTP. So right here, this is most likely going to be a get. And that, of course, tells the server that is responding to the HTTP request and handling this particular path or route, it's a get, which means it's going to be responsible for sending some information back to the user. In this situation here too, where we have a /index but with no file type, and it is representing a dynamic route or path within our application, this is most likely also going to be a GET request in HTTP terms. So it's going to be a GET request as well. Down here, because we have a products and then we also have a unique ID of a product, this is also most likely going to be a GET request. In other words, we're trying to get the data associated with this specific object that lives inside of this group of, or this collection, this set of resources that we call products. Now, the cool thing about routes in the context of HTTP is that we can use these same paths to perform different actions within our application. We can use different HTTP methods to make those actions happen while using the same path. So here we have the products resource collection, and here we've got a unique ID. The cool thing here is that when we use the GET with this path, usually it's going to go to a database, pull that information, and then send it back to the client. If we choose to use a PUT with this path, usually what's going to happen is that we are going to be passing some data along with the request to this URL, and we are going to be then updating the data that is in this resource instead of pulling the data. So important thing here that is also all a part of routing is the fact that in HTTP, we also have an HTTP body. So let's go ahead and let's add the HTTP body to our diagram. So we've got our HTTP body right here. Now, in our GET requests, we're not sending information. In other words, we're not trying to send information to the server. We're trying to get information from the server. So there's no body associated with these gets. We're not going to be passing any information. Now with a put, puts imply that we are trying to update something on the server. And so with a put, we are going to be providing some form of data along with the request that we're sending for this particular object inside of this particular collection. So if we're talking about products, maybe this ID represents some product that we have. So let's go ahead and kind of create a dummy product right here. So we've got a dummy product. I'm going to do it in JSON format. And this product has a name, and that name is going to be boots. So we're getting ourselves some hiking boots. And then maybe it has a cost associated with it, and that cost is, maybe it's $98. Right? So $98. Now, since we're just going to use a number, we're just going to use a number like that, $98. And maybe we have a inventory number, so a number of them left. So let's do inventory, and let's say that we have 5 pairs in our inventory right now. So with that, when we do a get, and let's highlight that using a different color so we can show the get coming in. When we have a get, the get is requesting a product, so a particular resource that we're calling product, and we want the one that has this particular ID in it. So we probably should have added an ID to this particular dummy object that we have right here, this representation of it. So let's do that really quick, just so we can stay 100% together on this example. So we're going to make this just a little bit bigger, and we're going to say that we have a product with a name, and it is boots. And we need to make sure that we actually have an ID in here. And we're going to say that this boots object has an ID of, and it looks like our ID is 23 WER 2342. So that's going to end up being our ID for the object for that particular instance of a product from that collection. And then we said it had a price, and the price was 98. And then we also said that we had an inventory, and in that we had 5 pairs. All right, so now we have a better example of this product right here. And so when that GET request comes in for this particular item, what's going to happen is our web application, no matter what framework it's built on, is going to go pull this from the database, and it's going to pull it based on that unique ID. And then this data is going to be sent back to the client in the body of our response. And so then the client's going to get that response back. Now, since we're focusing on routing, we're not going to worry about responses, but that's what would be pulled back. Now, when we do a put to this same route or path in our HTTP request, usually what we're going to do is we are going to be sending some updated information in order to update the specific item. So it would be our boots item. And so in our HTTP body, we are going to be expecting on the server side some JSON, some object with whatever the update is. And let's say that for this particular item, we are going to be updating the inventory because we just sold one. So we would say inventory is now 4 because we just sold a pair of boots. So that is going to be sent with this put. So let's go ahead and make sure we show that with the put, we're going to do an inventory update. So we're going to have an object with some data to do an update. It's still going to this particular route, but because when our application or when our router looks at, number one, what the HTTP method is, and then what the route or path is, because it is a put, it is going to need to check to see if we have an update right here. It's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to go pull this particular object from wherever the data store is. And then as a result, when it pulls that particular item, it's then going to go ahead and do an update on that item. So let's say it's name boots, and then we have our ID, and I'm just going to put some stars in there just to show that it's the same ID as we had before, and we have a price in there. It's going to be the same price as before, but our inventory is updated to 4 instead of 5. So as a result of this put, we're going to pull that object, but then we're going to update its data, and then of course that's going to be stored back in the database somewhere. So you can really think of a put as being equivalent to updating some resource, a unique resource, on the server. And you can see how routing really has to do with how we update or get or pull information from the web server or the web application. And again, it can be a monolithic web app that generates HTML pages and it's sending HTML back and forth, or it can be an API which is just sending JSON back and forth. Again, the cool thing about HTTP is because it has these methods, we can still use this exact same route or HTTP path on our URL. We can use it for another HTTP method. And we can use it for delete. And so when we use delete, instead of sending a body because we're not updating any kind of information, again, we're going to use the exact same path or route with this unique ID. And instead of updating it or pulling and getting it, we're actually going to delete this particular entity from our database or this object, this resource. And so with this particular get, what we're going to see is a destructive function happening on our server. So let's go ahead and change this to red, showing that it's destructive. We're going to see a destructive thing happen, and it's going to pull this particular entity from the database using the unique ID that was provided. And then, of course, it is going to go ahead and delete that object from our database. So we got get, put, and delete. The other one, the other verb or method that is extremely important in HTTP is going to be the put method. And so put usually uses a different path or route to create a new resource on the server or in the API. And that is going to be just the route to the resource that we're trying to manage. So in this case, if we're managing products, the path or route that we're going to have is going to be to /products with nothing following it. So /products right here. And when we do that with /products, what we're going to have is, again, oh, sorry, not put. We need to change that. That's my mistake right there. We are actually talking about a post. We already have a put up there for updating. What I meant to say is we are dealing with an HTTP post. Now, HTTP posts, they are associated with creating a brand new object within this collection or a brand new resource that we care about. And so when we do an HTTP post to this route or this path, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a brand new product. And in this case, just like with a put, we are going to provide an HTTP body. And in that body, we're going to provide the information that's specific to that type of resource, in this case, a product. So name, let's say that we don't have any gloves inside of our inventory. And so we're going to pass in a new item, which is going to be gloves. And then it is going to have a price. And maybe these are really cool gloves, so they're going to cost us $50. And then in the inventory, let's say we ordered from the manufacturer like 50 pairs of gloves. So along with this post, we are going to be passing another body in our HTTP request, and it is going to have all of the information to make a new resource. If you notice in the put, we only sent what we wanted to update. Here, we're creating a brand new object, so we want to provide all of the information to make a new object. One thing you will notice is that the object we're sending doesn't have a unique ID yet. And that's because that object hasn't been created by the server, which means it's not in our database. And usually we get our unique IDs from whatever data store we're using, so whatever our database is. So in this situation, this post is going to be sending that data to the /products URL. And in response, our server is going to go ahead, our web application or our API is going to go ahead and it is going to create for us a new resource, in other words, a new product with the name gloves and with the price of 50. And then it is going to have an inventory of 50. And then since we're storing it in the database and now it becomes a new item, it's going to give it a new ID. So maybe our ID is 45 GHF 56. Just some made up ID I just made up. And then it's standard practice now that it has a unique ID that in response we send back the ID or else the entire object back to the client so that it will then have the unique ID for this brand new product so that it can update it in its collection if it's a web app or an app, or if it's a mobile phone app, or if it's a single page React application or something like that. You'll want that unique ID back or the entire object. The cool thing too here is that not only can we use post with this particular route in order to create a new resource under that particular resource type, which in this case is products, we can also use get on it as well. And when we use a get with a generic route to a particular resource, what we end up having is a request to pull back from the database all products. That's usually how we implement that. So when we do a get to a generic resources route, then what's going to happen is our web application is going to make a request to the database right here, and it is going to pull back a complete list. And I'm just going to show that list just for speed's sake as an array of products. And inside of this array of products, I'm just going to go ahead for speed. We're going to show that we have the boots object. And of course, this isn't proper syntax. We're just kind of doing this for speed. We've got the entire boots object, so it would be all of the data that makes up the boots. And then we would have the gloves object that makes up all of the gloves. And so this array would then be sent back in the body of the response to the client. This right here is the basics of routing inside of web applications and web APIs in modern web development. And the really cool thing is that by doing this, we're taking advantage of the path that comes in through an HTTP request, as well as the HTTP methods to determine on the server side what type of action needs to happen, whether it be getting a very specific single resource, updating a very specific resource, or deleting a very specific resource, or it be creating a brand new specific resource, or getting an entire list of all resources of that type. This is how routing works. And as you've noticed, we use terms like resources and then unique IDs in order to identify the particular entities or objects that we're dealing with within the domain of our application. In other words, the world that our application lives in, it has particular objects that it cares about. And in this instance right here, we're talking about products. We could be talking about users. We could be talking about documents, or maybe we're dealing with blog posts or comments or anything like that. Those would be considered resources within our application domain. Hopefully this helps you understand the basics of routing within web applications and web APIs over the internet. And next, we're going to dive into how routing works specifically within Express, now that we have a generic understanding of routing.